G'day lads. Today I will be rebutting some of the attacks made against Australian head coach Justin Langer. As Australia's B-T20 side gets annihilated by a dominant West Indies team, a growing chorus of uninformed idiots are calling for Langer's head. This is ridiculous for a multitude of reasons. Whilst I have my own personal problems with the man they call JL, he is by far the best candidate for the job of Australian coach. An excellent way of demonstrating this is by comparing him with his predecessor, Darren Lehmann. Let's just introduce the man first. He has 23 tons with an aggregate of 7,696 runs at an average of 45.27. He also has served a decade of coaching apprenticeships before becoming Australia's head coach. He was initially an Australian assistant batting coach before becoming the coach of WA, my state, in 2012. Over 5 years, he won 3 BBL titles with the Perth Scorchers and nearly won WA's maiden Sheffield Shield title in 25 years. He also turned the ODI outfit into a dominant side. He is easily the most qualified person around right now to lead Australia. Before I do embark on an endless Langer love fest, let me give him some criticisms, as it is only fair I do so. Whilst he is far better than Darren Lehmann, I do have some issues with his style and outlook. Langer can have problems with guys I describe as touch players. JL loves the kind of guys who will run themselves to death. The guys who will do 10 laps of the oval instead of 2. I'll call these guys the Dennis Lillee type players. Lillee was famous for his stamina and drive, and there are anecdotes of club officials asking if he had done 4 laps. Nah, I've done 10, Lillee would reply. Now, touch players are like Usman Khawaja or Mark Waugh. Not the fittest kind of guys. They don't have the biggest rigs like Marcus Stoinis or work out for the longest time. They are finely attuned machines who often need support mentally and are often technically beautiful to watch. Langer has long struggled to fit these kind of players into his teams. The jettisoning of Khawaja, something I agreed with at the time considering Marnus Labuschagne's form, has gone on for simply far too long. Surely, Usman is a better test number 5 than Matthew Wade. Langer's inability to explain that omission is also a major failing. As we saw following the Border-Gavaskar series, his disciplinarian style also has some issues and has been seen as excessive by some players. Whilst it is far better than Lehmann's tolerance for a fetid culture, it is an issue. JL can also be prickly in relations with the media. Gone are the days of journalists taking the same old cliches and accepting them as facts. The newer breed is smarter, hungrier, and more determined to get to those facts. Langer has occasionally lost his cool under polite inquiry from the journalists, annoyed at their repeated dismissals of Langer's brand of cliches such as elite honesty. This in itself is a throwback to the Lehmann era. Only Australians can be the judge of what honesty is, and what's more, will be better at honesty, whatever that means, than anyone else. We will never cross that line, which we always arbitrate ourselves. These cliches are simply tiring and far less effective in modern times. Now I have demonstrated I am not a blind Langer worshipper, let the defence of Justin Lee Langer begin. People who clearly don't know what they're talking about have consistently cried out, "We would never lose these games under Boof." Ah, yes. Good old Boof. The man whose coaching era is described by my GOAT, Geoff Lemon, as a booze-filled bloke fest, where the training was hands-off, the bowlers all bowled 150 clicks, the bats scored at 7 and over, and the power and the coaching wisdom was captured in PowerPoint slides saying, watch the ball, C-U apostrophe T, you can figure out what that means. Yes, the same Lehmann who dropped Glenn Maxwell for no explained reason, it would later transpire that Steve Smith ardently dislikes the bloke, The coach of the team that featured such highlights as the "get ready for an effing broken arm" sledge by the Australian captain, mind you, the DRS debacle in India, abusing Johnny Bairstow regarding his father's death, about 10 different incidents involving David Warner, and a small matter called Sandpaper Gate. If you haven't already, get this book and this book. They are simply marvellous. Though, getting back to our tale, those calling for Lehmann are in essence calling for the return of that culture. A repugnant, disgusting culture which made the Australian cricket team the most hated team in the world. Casting results temporarily aside, that culture is more than deserving for a coach's removal. A lot of the blame towards this must go towards Lehmann. He has not had a perfect disciplinary record as a player himself, I might add. And funny that, these incidents have ceased largely since he left the building. A lot of the players have remained the same. There is only one variable that has dramatically changed. Now, let's talk about results. I would argue, given the opponents that Langer has faced so far, he has had a better return than Lehmann. Let's give you a summary of Lehmann's time as coach. Highlights first. 2 home Ashes successes, dominating, and I mean dominating, mediocre English opposition. A brilliant 2015 World Cup campaign, which saw a brilliant team orchestrate a brilliant victory, admittedly pissing off a lot of opponents at the same time. The 2014 away win in South Africa with a brilliant all-round team performance. Wins at home versus India, Pakistan, New Zealand and the West Indies. Away test victories in New Zealand. And then home ODI wins over England, South Africa and the West Indies. And away wins versus Pakistan. Now let's look at the bad. And it is not going to be pretty from here. 2 away Ashes defeats in 2013 and 2015, where England dominated Australia. 2 embarrassing World T20 campaigns in 2014 and 2016. A 2-0 test demolition in Pakistan in 2014, where the Australian team were utterly hopeless. An away 3-0 annihilation by Sri Lanka in 2016, where Rangana Haraf spun our batsmen into a literal spin. A 1-1 draw away to Bangladesh. That has never happened in the history of Australian cricket. An embarrassing home loss to South Africa following that Sri Lanka series in 2016-17. The 3-1 loss to South Africa during the ball tampering series. An abysmal 5-0 away ODI loss to South Africa in 2016, where Australia were blown off the park. And also losing 2-1 at home to Sri Lanka in a 2017 T20 series. As you can see, there's been some good, some massive highs, and then a lot of dismal lows. Now let's just briefly compare the teams. From 2013 to 2015, Lehmann had a team that was far better than anything Langer has had. The opening partnership of the swashbuckling Warner and the stoic but deadly Rogers, followed by the enigmatic Shane Watson, Clark, and then Smith. Number 6 was an issue. It still is. Brad Haddon was a better keeper than anyone since. I'm sorry, Jesus Payne, I cannot admit that. Might be just as good at gloving, but not with the bat. And then the bowling lineup. Johnson, Siddle, Stark, Harris, Bird, and Lyon were simply brilliant. Since the retirement of a swath of greats, the batting became brittle. Warner and Smith dominated a team surrounded by a constantly shifting deck. Marsh ×2. Burns, Enriquez, Renshaw, Nick Maddinson, Adam Voges, Hilton Cartwright, Callum Ferguson. Whilst the bowling was still outstanding, Australia's batting was paper thin, a trend which continued into Langer's time as coach. Now let's look at Langer in chronological order for some consistency. A 5-0 away ODI loss to England. A depleted team lost by the closest 5-0 margin experienced. Twice they made 300 plus and were easily beaten. They also lost by 3 wickets and 1 wicket in other games. Then there was the 481 on a tiny Trent Bridge ground. A 1-0 away loss to Pakistan. The team showed admirable fight in the first test, especially Khawaja, Payne, Head and Finch. Then an embarrassing loss in the second test. Losses at home in ODI and T20 to South Africa and India. Then there was the 2-1 loss to by a depleted team lacking confidence against a dominant India. Then the first marvel. Away T20 and ODI wins in India. When was the last time you heard that happen? A 2-0 T20 win was backed up by a 3-2 ODI win. And what a series that was. A 5-0 away demolition of Pakistan. This was simply a brilliant display. And then we reached the World Cup semi-finals. A team that was unbalanced by the return of Warner and Smith, which forced Khawaja to drop down to 3 and often had to bat in an unfamiliar slogging role, and forced Shaun Marsh, who'd recently hit career best form at 3, to do the same. And a team also lacking any consistent all-rounders, and brilliantly beat a number of top-class opposition. Warner, Finch, Cummins, Stark, and the underappreciated Alex Carey were the stars. Only a rampant England and a dominant India defeated this team, retaining the Ashes away from home. That is simply a monumental result. The 2-2 result could have easily been 3-1 if not for an embarrassing loss at Headingley with Ben Stokes' marvel, and then a loss in the final test at the Oval, where Australia might have celebrated too hard in the days previous. This was Australia's first success in England in 18 years. Home T20 demolitions of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, followed by a test annihilation of both Pakistan and New Zealand. A hard-fought 2-1 away ODI loss to India. That is a more than credible result in the conditions. Then we have the hard-fought series again in England. Australia lost 2-1 in the T20s and choked in the first game before winning the ODI series 2-1 against the best ODI team in the world. And then we have the 2-1 ODI victory versus India, the 2-1 loss in T20s to India, and then there's the mental Border-Gavaskar series, which Australia could have easily won considering how close that series was. India ultimately prevailed 2-1 before we have the current 3-0 debacle from the B team in West Indies. So to summarise, Langer has done a lot better than Lehmann considering the team he had. There are some outstanding highs in that period, even during the time when the team was on its lowest point. Langer spent much of this period lacking 2 of the best players, something that Lehmann consistently had despite the brittle batting lineup. The team has also played the world's 3 best teams a ridiculous number of times. It always seems like Langer's team is coming up against England, New Zealand or India. Langer's batting lineup has also been extremely dysfunctional. Every single batting position was an issue at some point during his tenure. Opening and the middle order remain a problem. Now, let me just list off some of Langer's revolving door in tests only. Finch, Head, Wade, Harris, Bancroft, Khawaja, Marsh ×2, Pattinson, Burns, John Holland, Patterson, Siddle, Labuschagne, Stark and Green. That's a 16-man squad. That's all of our contract list. Langer cannot miraculously summon players like a magician. Lehmann has consistently had a far better team for over half of his tenure, and even then, his batting lineup was still better than anything Langer has had up until recent times. Langer also had to deal with the aftermath of Lehmann's mistakes and rebuild a team which had grown fetid and stale. He has simply done a tremendous job. Alongside Tim Payne, he has rebuilt the image of the Australian cricket team. So please, can we stop calling for his head, actually look back at some of the brilliant series that he's won, stop living right now, and appreciate the genius of Justin Lee Langer.